Today's subject is very different from what we saw till now. It's about the utopization of the island in some of the films which deal with our subject. So I will present the general problematic, and we will see some clips from this book, three or four films according to the schedule, the time we will have. So, okay, I begin with some general remarks I partly already presented at the beginning of the first semester, and then I come to my subject of response. So, as cinema or movie making is both an industry, it can offer the best as well as the worst. In this course, I constantly insist on the industrial dimension of cinema as a factory, whose destination is to manufacture narratives which are intended for the broad public, the general public. In relation with this conflict, the war film has been invented in Hollywood as a genre, special genre, and this during the Second World War, in order to commit the cinematographic industry to war efforts and to the patriotic mobilization of the population. Dozens of films have been released during the war, many of them shot by the most, war films, of course, shot by the most famous film directors of that time and staging the most renowned actors. All kinds of different genres, Air Force films, battle in the jungle films, submarine films, etc. Films which were produced by the Hollywood major companies, and this like on assembly line. And for this reason, films whose artistic value is, as a rule, rather low. After the war, this war film genre has not faded at all. On the contrary, the war in the Pacific and in East Asia being an inexhaustible source for, after the war, less, as we saw, less simplistic, less openly propagandistic narratives than those issued during the war. And films issued during the war which were often intended at presenting the enemy, that is, the Japanese people as a whole, as subhumans, barbarians, monkeys, and so on. But still, as a general rule, war films are very costly undertakings because you have to reconstruct battle. So they target, as I said, a wide general public. Their promoters have to solve all kinds of complex technical problems. If you reconstruct Pearl Harbor, it's not such a simple thing. So they have to recourse to all sorts of special effects, etc. And this is the reason why these films are very rarely artistic masterpieces. They are, as a rule, flowers of cinema as an industry rather than as an art. Big budget films, American big budget films like Tora Tora Tora, Pearl Harbor, Emperor of the Sun by Steven Spielberg, but as well Chinese film from the mainland, Flowers of War. We saw parts of it during the first semester. All these films are perfect examples of what I just said. Okay, in today's presentation, I would like to enhance a completely different dimension of war film. It's imaginary power of powers. I mean, the capacity of war film, of some war films, to displace the audience of the film from the usual topography of war, which is made of armed clashes, terror, death, blood, etc. Displace the public to other spaces which appear as protected barriers. That is, unexpected recesses, where the war, which is raging all around, is like suspended. This providential topography, where fierce enemies meet, but where some kind of a spell interrupts the war. This is, in most of the films I will present today, an island. This topography is an island. A small island lost in the vast expanse of the Pacific. If you prefer, a lost island. Forgotten is an island, sometimes having no name at all. The space which, for this very reason, is available for various imaginary projections. The issue island in this cinematography draws our attention onto this very interesting property of the island from the viewpoint of imagination. The island, as in general, can be both an utopia or, let's say, the substratum for an utopia, like in famous Thomas More essay, and or as well it can be what Foucault calls an heterotopia. That is, as Foucault says, un espace autre, that is literally translated, a space other, rather than just another space, a space other. As Foucault stresses it, utopia and heterotopia are not only different, they contrast. They contrast, and this notably on this issue. Utopia is the complete fruit of imagination. It has no real, no tangible location. Heterotopia, by contrast, is something that exists. It is a space that can be located, that can be named. It's a space which is people inhabited, visited, used for different purposes. Among utopias, Foucault mentions, just by passing, all kinds of very different things. The ship, he says, a garden, a brother, an attic, etc. can be an heterotopia, can be considered as heterotopia, or can become, under certain circumstances, heterotopias. And this because they are endowed with this capacity, with this ability to tear us from those normal spaces where everyday life takes place. And the heterotopias have the capacity to make us differ from ourselves, make us, tear us apart from our usual everyday condition. So what utopia and heterotopia have in common, in spite of their strong differences, which are stressed by Foucault, what they have in common is their special, their privileged link with imagination. The island can be an imaginary state from the angle of utopia, that is the pure creation of imagination, or as well from the angle of heterotopia, there can be a real island where those who land on it, as you will see in the films I will show, will learn how to displace themselves, how to become different from what they are or what they are supposed to be from their profession, from their past, etc. This is the issue I would like to deal with by presenting some of these films where a counter-narrative of war, about war, emerges, or if you prefer, a narrative other, just to go the same way as Foucault does about heterotopia. That is narrative other in relation with this topic, island, the island. An alternative narration of war, which is based on what another French philosopher, Gilles Deleuze, would call a line of flight, or if you prefer, an evading line, ligne de fuite. Evading line out of the standard war narrative, which is usually, as you know, placed under the sign of horror and terror. So I will begin with two films I like. This is why I choose them. I've chosen them. So the first one will be Heaven Knows Mr. Madison by John Huston, and the second, Hell in the Pacific, not at all by John Huston as I wrote, but by John Boorman. John Boorman, a mistake. Both of them, as you will see, are what we can call actor films. That is, staging famous, very famous stars, as in the first, we will see Deborah Kerr and Robert Mitchum for the former, and for the latter, Lee Marvin and Toshiro Mifune. But they are not only this, I think, they are not only actor films. First, let's take notice of the dates of the shooting of these films. That is the end of the 50s, end of the 60s. That means a generation's distance from the end of the war. That is time to take some detachment from the traumatic event, from war at the traumatic event. Time to become critical to the original narratives of this war. The original narratives which were, as I already said, propagandist, patriotic, and constantly embittered by the conditions of total war. But, okay, a distance, a decade, or 2 decades, that means not far enough for the event to have completely cooled down. The ideal, and this is, I think, the ideal distance for this kind of counter-narrative. Very favorable conditions for this kind of counter-narrative to emerge, or to be imaged. So let's begin with Huston's film, which is what we can call the perfect romance sonata. That is a variation, very obviously, on the plot of the famous, very famous novel by Daniel Defoe, Robinson Crusoe. Slightly but constantly ironical reenactment completely unrealistic of Defoe's narration, and this under the conditions of the war in the Pacific. So it's a story of a very tough Marine Corps infantryman, his name is Allison, who is stranded on a small, very beautiful dream island after a shipwreck. He seems to be the only survivor. And there, on this island, instead of running into a Japanese garrison, he meets a young and beautiful American novice, who herself is the only survivor of a group of nuns and priests, American nuns and priests who have been killed, all of them etc., by the Japanese. Both of them become rapidly aware that they are just the two of them, as Western or white people on the island, and in this condition placed under the threat of the Japanese army, of a comeback of the Japanese army on the island. Houston's narrative ability and cleverness consists in this film in making that nothing happens according to what the public is expecting after this, let's say, promising opening. Nothing will happen as we imagine that it will or that it should. That is, no return to nature in the sense of thriller style, self-restraint and constraint as the expression of the ethical value of both characters. This is the issue the narration insists on. So, as you see from the brief view on the plot, this film is typically an utopia. The island is, of course, imaginary, it's a fiction, and this fiction is not very probable. But what matters is that the island appears here as a world apart in the general context of the war. That is a micro-topography which offers like a parenthesis in war conditions. A very old French philosopher, a friend of mine, his name is René Chérère, about 90 years old today, and who wrote several books on utopia and utopianism. So René defines utopia as epoche in Greek. That's an old philosopher who speaks Greek. Epoche means interruption or cut in ancient Greek. So this philosopher, René Chérère, suggests that the utopia, the utopia as epoche, cut or interruption, is called up by something which comes from outside. That is, here precisely in this film, from the historical situation. A violence which comes from outside and which awakes our imagination. It seems to me that this approach of utopia perfectly catches up this film's state. The island on which Alison, the Marine soldier, and Sister Angela, the nun, are meeting, have met, is an oasis in an ocean of war. It is for them both a place for rescue, and that's from various angles. not only a place where survivors from a shipwreck or from a massacre can come together, but it is more than that. It is a rescue place where a community is set up. A community which saves human civilization and values from the war disaster and havoc. For in this social microcosm, these two protagonists of the film save the whole of humanity from the apocalypse, that is war. And this, they save it, they save all of this by resisting to the temptation of becoming, let's say, carefree animals. I mean, beginning to live like Eva before the original sin. Alison, let's take Alison, this character. He's, of course, he's in love with beautiful sister Angela. Alison is not at all a born gentleman. It's quite the opposite. He's an orphan, he's a rebel child, he has been raised up in a reformatory, and then he has been made a man, as he says, by the Marine School, which is very trying, difficult training. But in spite of all his, let's say, handicaps, he behaves. And by respecting Sister Angela and treating her as an equal, he makes of this island a refuge or a sanctuary where the essential values of civilized life are preserved. And this, I repeat, I insist, at a time as total war gives free rein to barbarism, and this on both sides. More precisely, the small island becomes some kind of, let's say, Noah's Ark, which rescues two survivors of the democratic world, and this as the flood of war overwhelms everything. Two persons, a man and a woman, each of them, let's notice by passing, each of them embodying very strong institutions, the army, the church. So these two persons are face to face. Each of them has to work hard in order to understand and accept the other's position, that is his reason, his view on everything, that is as well his difference. This acceptance, mutual acceptance of the other's, let's say, reasons. This is the basic condition for their small and provisional heaven or community, which is this tropical island with palm trees, sand beaches, etc. It is the condition for this heaven not to become a hell. Mutual respect and equality are at this place pointed up as the main component or components of the human link. They talk, they argue, they very often disagree, they misunderstand each other, very often. But force, violence, never take the precedence over communication and tolerance. Self-control, or let's say self-constraint, I refer here to the English, German, Jewish sociologist Norbert Elias, self-constraint, over desire and passion appear at this place as the only possible dam which can resist the relapse of the survivors into the state of nature. Okay, of of course, this is a fable. It's even, if you prefer, some kind of a fairy tale. It's a pure imagination game. But by imagination, what is meant here is not our capacity to elude reality, but on the opposite, our capacity to give shape to reality. This film is a game with the impossible, for very obviously the situation depicted in it is quite unrealistic. But this is not what matters. This is not what really matters. What really matters is the power of a filmic narrative, which actually is a counter-narrative, a narrative of resistance. All these expressions, I derive them from Foucault, conducts or behaviors of resistance, etc. And which is the power of film, of a filmic counter-narrative, which is endowed with the capacity to, let's say, it's difficult to translate for me, to thwart, but what I mean is a French verb, contrarier, to go against, let's say, reality in its most common form. And this notion, thwarting, I borrow it from a book by a French philosopher, Jacques Rancière, the book being called La Fable Cinématographique. I imagine that it exists in English, a very interesting. So, okay, now let me make this more explicit. What do I really mean by this? Okay, this is somehow philosophy. The most common reality of war, as depicted by realistic war movies, is made of battles, sufferings, extreme violence, a lot of noise, defeat, victory, crimes, cruelty, etc. If you watch most of the films on the war in the Pacific, you will be impressed by the gigantic size that is of these films, that is the use of real vessels, of real submarines, even if outdated at the time the film is shot. But still, real submarines made out of steel, real warplanes. It's made out of the mobilization of thousands of extras, out of the realistic imitation of real battles, as realistic as possible, in spite of the growing use of special effects to electronics today, okay, but still in spite of it. War cinema, from this angle, is the captive of past events. It is the captive of past history and of those who made it. The reason why none of these films can be shot without the active cooperation of the army, which provides all vessels, planes, adequate locations, human material, that is soldiers, for the mass scene. And this is the reason why in all the scenes, at the beginning, at the end of the film, you have these credits thanking heartfully the Navy, the Air Force, the infantry, the Marines, etc., etc. Because without the help, the contribution, the collaboration of these sectors of the army, the shooting of the film would be impossible. So, in that sense, all these films are captives. They are captives of some kind of, let's say, mimetic repetition of real war, of actual war. And then, the imaginative game of a film like Heaven Knows, Mr. Allison, it is to distort, to thwart this oppressive reality of war, or go against its survival imitation, which takes place in many other war films. And this by presenting a flight line, a vanishing line, out of it. That is, by inventing another present of war. That is another possible or impossible experience of war. What the film invents is very obviously a world, a small world, microcosm. Something which doesn't exist, but which has still to exist. Which has to exist, which can exist under the form of a fable or a fairy tale. And this so that our common world can be saved from the desolation of war. This fable presents the imperative necessity of another world, which has to be opposed to the very oppressive reality of war. And this has to be done by mobilizing the powers of imagination. Imagination is at this place what emancipates us from the tyranny of war conditions. The magic of cinema, in such a case, is its power of inventing in, let's say, a splinter of time, 90 minutes, inventing another world. And this other world, in this splinter of time, will be more true than the real one. This is what matters. The living community, Private Alison and Sister Angela, invent on their desert island is more true, I mean in terms of human values and principles, than the barbaric reality the states and powers at war in the Pacific do shape. And this is where we encounter, we meet on, bump into the key philosophical issue, the core of the philosophical issue of the films, which are, entertaining films too, but which, this is what I'm trying to suggest or to show, which, in spite of all, have some sort of philosophical core. So, what is it? We of course, in general, we have to face reality as it is. That is, we have to acknowledge reality as it comes to us. And this even as it shows a very ugly and repulsive face. We should never indulge in such situations in transforming established facts into simple opinions, as Alain stresses it. And we know that we even sometimes have to face reality as if we had to look at Medusa in the eye, as we have to confront with phenomena like Auschwitz or Hiroshima. Okay, this is one thing. But on the other hand, at the same time, we constantly have to defend, to promote the rights of the truth against this tyranny of reality. And this means that we have, of course, to acknowledge reality, see things as they are, but not to accept it in any condition. And this means that we often have to oppose truth, what we can call here truth, to reality. If we think that reality is what we have to adapt to, what we have to adapt under any condition, and whatever it looks like. So, if we adopt this principle, we will say, for example, that in a time of total war, like the Pacific War, the only rule which would prevail for anybody is violence, hate of the enemy, every man for himself in this chaos, etc. And in this context, any of us will become the pure and simple object of total war and give up any ethic principle, and this in order to adapt to the situation which is placed under the sign of exception. The only thing we will have is to try to survive. And then we will become the moral hostages of total war. And this is, of course, what most of the soldiers, US or Japanese, who have been involved in this armed conflict have become, beyond their humanity. So this is where our human capacity to say that the rights of truth have, in some circumstances, to prevail over the tyranny of reality is crucial. That we can persist in taking into account other values and principles, that we can differ from these crushing conditions and break our moral political encircling by these conditions. And this is exactly, in the interpretation I propose, of course, what this film does, as it presents another, a completely unexpected phase of war, of this war in the Pacific. That is, as this film invents another possible reality which brings us back to humanity, that is, to civilized life, that is, as well, to an habitable common world. But we have to notice here that in order to make this displacement from a suffocating reality to true life, we absolutely need the support from imagination. We need to tear us apart from this reality as this reality enslaves us. And this effort for emancipating us from the tyranny of reality has to be backed by imagination. And then the island taken into consideration from the angle of utopia or as well heterotopia is the imaginary support or material or the prop for this project. Of course, this word apart, which embodies a great film director, John Huston, his capacity to oppose the truth and the power of art to the devastating effects of war on human civilization, this can only be very fragile. And we have to accept the convention according to which two ordinary human beings lost on an island have the faculty to, literally speaking, save mankind from the disaster of war. As I said, this is a tale, and we have to make, in circumstances like this, the very risky bets, which is a philosophical and moral bet, according to Pascal, bet that in certain conditions, this kind of very improbable change of direction or bifurcation, this will take place not only in that kind of the form or this kind of dream Huston's film is, but it can happen in reality. That is, instead, to take another filmic example, instead of starting a fight, the enemies begin to talk together, or as we saw it previously in the beautiful Japanese film, The Burmese Heart. The enemies will begin not talk together, but to sing in choir together. Okay, we will see the first clips now from Huston. Okay. This is the beginning of it. like to talk now on John Bowman's film. Bowman is a well-known filmmaker. You certainly know some of his films, the very famous Deliverance, Excalibur, Hope and Glory. Hell in the Pacific is his contribution to the construction of a cinematographic collective narration of the war in the Pacific. And in this film, he reawakens very familiar Western figures of narrative, like the already mentioned Robinson Crusoe, but also Hegel's struggle between the master and the servant. In this very simplified reconstruction of the war in the Pacific, he imagined that only two soldiers from the two conflicting camps, that is an American, I think, Marine Corps soldier, it's not quite clear, and a Japanese officer are stranded on a desert island in the middle of the South Pacific. And it begins, as you will see, as a fight to death. The Japanese, who has arrived first on the island and has taken his measures for his survival, sees the unexpected intrusion of the American in his kingdom as a mortal threat. He refuses to give him water. So they do not have, at the beginning, they do not have any common word. They don't have any common language. And each one's goal is to keep at a distance from the other, and then to try to get the better of him by making of him his servant or his slave. And so you will see they become alternately, each on his turn, the other's slave. And this as their common days on the island go by. But it is not Bowman's intention to depict the conditions of total war at the scale of this microcosm. That is the confrontation between these two soldiers on this lost island. What his imagination tends or inclines to is to present, it's a philosophical fable or tale. He will show how in the dialectic process of their relations, the two men have to pass, and this in order to survive, to try to survive, they have to pass from open hostility and mutual violence to some kind of a companionship based on mutual interest, but also as well on a very unusual friendship, let's say. Each one speaks his own language, the other doesn't understand, but still they manage to build a raft and to sail to a bigger island where a bloody battle between Japanese and Americans has just taken place. Bowman's tale is openly utopian. The island is the location for an anti-war narrative, a counter-narrative, again, of the war in the Pacific as a collective outfit of barbarity. The American doesn't cut his dead enemy's ears as a war trophy, as Marine Corps soldiers used to do during the battles in the Pacific. I already mentioned John Dower's book on this, War Without Mercy. The Japanese officer does not bayonet or behead wildly his prisoner. On the opposite, they stand and face together their very destitute condition. They set up some kind of elementary community. And this is the political horizon, political stake of Bowman's film. which we have to remember at this place has been shot in 1968. That is at the time as war was raging in Vietnam, a moment at which an important part of the young people in the West opposed their dreams and the power of imagination to the barbarity of the new American war in Southeastern Asia, a time at which people from my own generation in the West used to tag on the walls of our universities slogans like "L'imagination pouvoir," that is, imagination to power, something like that, which is actually a very ambiguous claim, but which at the time was inseparable from our hostility to any kind of imperialist work, a feeling women's film is perfectly in accordance and in harmony with. So, imagination is here again, as in Huston's film, what makes it possible for an artist to reinvent war and to turn a war narrative into an anti-war manifesto. This narrative, or this, let's say, discursive operation, needs a support. It needs a topographic support. And this support is here again, the island. The island as something both very material, that is made out of sand, as we saw, sand, palm trees, springs, rocks, etc. And on the other hand, purely imaginary. These films have no name, or yes, it's not true. In Huston's films, the island had a name, but in a woman's film, it has no name. They don't exist or hardly exist on a map. They are quasi-concepts. That is, images. They are images, but images with conceptual value or density, if you prefer. For this reason, the island in these films, and I insist on this issue, is both utopia, that is nowhere island, and heterotopia, a visible location, because there exists actually a real island where these films had to be shot. Of course, a film, and especially that kind of film, a film is always open to various interpretations. It is always torn apart between its artistic and its industrial or commercial dimension. The interpretation I suggest of both films we are talking about here puts a spell. I put the spell on their imaginative powers or capacities. But as well, one could contradict this interpretation and say as well, Hell in the Pacific is an opportunistic movie which praises the new friendly relation between the United States and Japan at a time as the US military bases in Okinawa made it possible for the B-52 to bomb North Vietnam, the dams of North Vietnam. This film puts together two giants, two very famous actors, one from Hollywood and one from Japanese cinema industry, so Lee Marvin and Toshiro Mifune, and this, of course, in order to make the public swallow, let's say, the bitter pill of the ambiguous message. This less optimistic and more critic interpretation is completely acceptable, of course, and about heaven knows what we just saw right now. One could as well object that this film appears to be, after all, a plea for sexual repression, social conformism, that is the Puritan version of the island's utopia. This position, this interpretation can be defended. So this other reading of Huston's film is quite plausible. But it is not, for me, it is not really what matters. What I'm trying to show is how a movie maker can, just by giving free rein to the imaginative powers of cinema, can make an image emerge from the core of a world at war, which is the complete other of what is usually associated with war. It can make emerge something, an image, which is completely different from what is usually associated with war. Cinema as an art based, relying on always more and more sophisticated technical devices, cinema has a special and unique capacity to boost, to support imagination. The audience, the public's imagination in general, and every spectator's imagination in particular. This is the dream-like capacity of cinema, which has been picked out by various authors, and that's from a long time already. I mentioned here a French book which is well known and called The Cinéma ou l'homme imaginaire, Cinema and the Imaginary Man by Edgar Morin, sociologist, philosopher. Okay, in these two films, cinema does not present itself as a dream machine intended for entertainment only, that is, as a manufacturer of pleasant and frivolous dreams. It makes other possible worlds appear, and this again from the background of the most depressing and dark reality, total war. It makes a possible, that is, a virtual world appear, whose otherness is distinct, clear, because the horizon of this virtual world is not the destruction of the enemy, it is not victory, it is not conquest, it is equality, it is community, it is fraternity. From the moment on, this other world has been sketched out by a film which has met its audience. This other world already has become something more than a dream, that is a pure vision or an unsubstantial fantasy. Because as it has reached its public, it has already begun to make its way into the gesture, into the behaviors, into the convictions of the spectators. Spectators who also, of course, are citizens, workers, ordinary people, but people whose thoughts and inclinations do matter for common life. I mean, people who, as society or part of society, have the real or actual capacity to shape another world or other worlds out of the present. For this reason, the imaginary powers of cinema have to be taken into consideration, not so much in the dimension of the evasion from reality, as reality is dull or grim, but in the dimension of invention of becoming. That is, it has to be taken into account not mainly as entertainment, entertainment being, of course, what is supposed to help us to accept, to tolerate the present condition, considered, taken into account as inseparable, that is, present condition taken into consideration in a static perspective. Cinema here has to be considered as an intensifier of our possible becoming other, that is a possibility for us to become something different from what we are, or of our will, of our desire to differ from this present, that is to emancipate ourselves from this present, as it is rendered, etc., etc. So cinema, this kind of film, considered here in a dynamic perspective. So just a remark to finish with on finish with the development on imagination. Imagination. In French, we have two words for imagination. In English, imagination. We can say imaginaire or imagination. And in its relation to cinema, the distinction between these two terms in French can be of great value, and we don't have it in English. So this is why I would like to stress it a bit. The imaginaire, it's a whole set of images, fantasies, which the audience of the film, as a human mass, let's say both heterogeneous and compact, has in common. Imaginaire is collective, it's social. It is a milieu made of images, all kinds of images. So the imaginary man Edgar Morin talks about in the book I mentioned, already mentioned, this imaginary man designs the social subject who shares an indefinite number of images with other social subjects. And for this reason, of course, movie making as an industry and a business, movie making constantly draws on this inexhaustible reserve of images. That is social imagination, shared imagination of the public, social imaginaire. And movie making derives all kinds of narratives, plots, from the collective feelings, from the sensation, the emotions, which are associated in the public's mind with these images. Which means that cinema as an industry, that is manufacturing blockbusters, soap operas, catastrophe films, thrillers, etc., cinema actually is made mostly of the intensification effects of these shared feelings, which are related to the subconscious collective images, which are shared by all the public. So actually what the audience, what the public consumes with these products of cultural industry, it's nothing else, it's nothing but its own fears, its own desires, its own phobias, its own hopes. All this boosted by the cinematographic manufacture of pictures. So filmic pictures intensify, maximize the images the social subjects have in common. These images, actually, they come from the public itself. So this for imaginaire. Imagination is something completely different. It's completely different. Imagination. Imagination, it has a completely different meaning. It designs the share of the virtual images. That is, as Sartre noticed it in his book called L'Imaginaire, precisely, the creative dimension of what Sartre called the imaginative or the picturing consciousness, la conscience imageante. So as I already mentioned it about the films, l'imagination, the imagination, it is what makes it possible for us to have an intuition of something which, as possible, as different, would not purely and simply derive from the present condition. I mean something which cannot be reduced or taken back to these conditions as a premise, a potential. The classical example here is, of course, in Hegel's dialectic, the flower bud. The flower bud taken into account as the premise of the flower itself. That is, the flower actually is already contained in the bud. The bud is the promise of the flower. Okay. The imagination, in the French sense of l'imagination, is, on the contrary, what makes it possible to have the intuition of a possible change of direction. That is a bridge. That means a differentiation process. Something which may happen, but which may happen being placed under the sign of difference, of otherness, and this by contrast with self-development. As this issue appears suddenly in a film, as it does, I think, in the film we are talking about today, it is then a sign that cinema as an art has not yet been completely whipped out by industry and business. And this is, of course, a very crucial issue. Even in films like that, which are, of course, commercial films too, very obviously. So this is what I hope to, this is what I'm trying to convince you of by showing you some of the clips of these films. That is, that even films like that, which are very evidently intended for the general public, wide public, which make so many commercial concessions to the taste of the public by using famous actors, etc., etc. In spite of all that, this dimension of what the French philosopher Gilles Deleuze called the virtual, this dimension can be detected in these films. That is, the possibility for us at any moment to differ from our present. Okay, this was about a romance film. Are you ready to see 7 minutes of something rather funny or not? Yes? Are you available for 7 minutes? 7:30, I should say. 7:30. Okay. On skip juste ça au passé. So it's from a film which is a musical. It's at the origin it's from Broadway. It's a musical comedy which is called South Pacific by Joshua Logan. I forgot when it was shot. So it's about an officer, yes, an American officer who is in a special mission on an island in the South Pacific. And okay, you will see the perfect utopization of the island in this sequence.